The passage before us gives the account of the three famous Hebrew children, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, or as you know them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This story is a remarkable reminder of God's tremendous power, that even during times of great distress or persecution, God is able. Years ago, the Statler brothers wrote and sang a song entitled "The Fourth Man." The song records the story that is found in our text, and in part it says, here's a story. I'm not going to sing it. Here's a story from the good book we know, a story about a miracle that happened long ago. We hope that you'll take courage when temptation you meet. There's somebody watching you who's strong when you're weak. They wouldn't bend. They held on to the will of God, so we're told. They wouldn't bow. They would not bow their knee to the idol made of gold. They wouldn't burn. They were protected by the fourth man in the fire. They wouldn't bend. They wouldn't bow. They wouldn't burn. It is my desire to look into this text in order to encourage you. Really, truly, that is my heart, but you might think, that's not much encouraging going on. Well, we trust that you will be encouraged. Our present society lends itself to a great deal of distress. And while the future is uncertain, it would appear that persecution is also on the horizon. And how shall we respond? Well, my encouragement to you is, do not bow. But that will take God's grace. But the title of the message tonight, as we look into this story, do not bow. And so let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you for the privilege once again to share your word. And I pray that you would bless that which you've laid upon my heart to share. And I ask that you would open up our hearts by the power of your Spirit, that, Lord, even though we've heard this story again and again and again and again, that it would not be so familiar that we miss the truth of it. And so we ask that you would direct us and see the things that are here as a warning to us, but also the encouragement to us of what you can do and how you can protect and how you can guide. And so let us be the witness that we need to be, and grant us all the grace that we need to live up under any type of persecution that may come our way. And Father, give us the grace that we need, that we would not bow, so that we would honor you and you alone, because you are God and God alone. And so we love you tonight. We honor you. We praise you. We pray that your will would be done. Save the lost and encourage the saved. We ask it in Jesus' name, and amen. Well, we want to look at the passage. It's a fairly lengthy passage, so we want to consider the entire chapter, Daniel chapter 3. The first thing I want to mention to you is in verse 1 down through verse 7, which I have entitled Politics. Now, normally when we read a text like this, we just place ourselves back into the time of the Babylonians, and we think that so many thousands of years ago, and we just don't associate with it to our day and time. What I've chosen to do is entitle the word politics for these verses, because this is a political situation. It was just a political situation back then, but we can learn from that political situation and apply to our even present day political situation. So consider that as you go through the text and you read what the history has provided for us. We note the politics, verse 1 through verse 7. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, made an image of gold, whose height was 60 cubits, and the breadth thereof 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura, in the province of Babylon. Then Nebuchadnezzar, the king, sent to gather together the princes, the governors, and the captains, the judges, and the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces, to come to the dedication of the image which Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. Then the princes, the governors, and captains, and the judges, the treasurers, the counselors, the sheriffs, and all the rulers of the provinces were gathered together unto the dedication of the image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then a herald cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages, that at what time ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. And whosoever falleth not down and worship shall the same hour be cast into the midst of a burning fiery furnace. Therefore at that time, when all the people heard the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and all kinds of music, all the people, the nations, and the languages fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And so as we enter into the chapter in this story itself, of course the text involves a political event. This is a government thing. This is Nebuchadnezzar is the king over Babylon. This is a monarchy. You might call it a dictatorship perhaps. But this is a government issue event. This is something that deals with the nation that is underneath him. Now as we look at this and we see that Nebuchadnezzar makes this image made of gold, why would he do a thing like that? Well, if you'll just back up into chapter 2 for just a second, I would remind you that in chapter 2 there's an account of where Nebuchadnezzar had this dream of this great image, and there was a head of gold and a chest of silver and so forth, and he needed an interpretation, and Daniel interpreted it for him. And in Daniel chapter 2 and in verse 37, we read in the text where it says, Thou, O king, art the King of kings, for the God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, and strength, and glory. I'll put that on the back burner. I'm not going to bring it back off, but you just think about that for just a moment. Why was he king? So think about that when you think about our own government. Anyway, verse 38, And wheresoever the children of men dwell, the beasts of the field and of the fowls of the heaven, he hath given into thine hand, and hath made thee the ruler over them all. Thou art this head of gold. And so he had this dream, and Daniel interprets that dream unto him. And you know what? He begins thinking about that, and he decides, I'm going to make an image to myself. And so that leads me to the second point under this, and that is that leaders tend to cater to their own whims and often develop a God complex. And you know, there'll be an individual that you might even know them personally, and they're good people, and they're kind individuals, but they get in a position of power. They get in a position of government, and all of a sudden they change. There's a difference. And you see these people, these politicians, and a great many of them, they really seem like great people. They're children of God, believers, and but then when they get into the position of power, they get into government, something seems to click. And so what we find here is this is what happens to Nebuchadnezzar. He was already full of himself, no doubt. I mean, he believed that he was the King of Kings before Daniel ever told him. But now that, well, the God of heaven has made you this head of gold, and you're the best because you are made of gold. And so he develops this statue that is 9 feet wide and 90 feet tall. That's a big statue. I can't help but think that the many times that I've seen pictures of the Middle Eastern mindset and these governments that fall, they all make statues of themselves. Hussein, I mean, all the bunch over there, whenever they'd fallen, they had to pull down their statues. They all make statues of themselves. Well, that's just like Nebuchadnezzar. That's exactly what he did. He has this God complex, makes this statue 90 feet high, 9 feet wide. Point number 3, being leaders, they require complete loyalty from their officers. Nebuchadnezzar calls everybody, the sheriffs, the rulers, the province, the princes, and he calls everybody that's under his realm that he's responsible for, and he says, I expect complete loyalty from you. Not only that, what they're going to do is they're going to enforce their power, their will upon the populace. And so we read about all that list in verse 3. We're not going to read all that again, but you look into verse 4, the herald cried aloud, to you it is commanded, O people, nations, and languages. Not just the people that are in government underneath the head guy, it's everybody. And so these political leaders get in a place and position of power such as Nebuchadnezzar, and they say, you must listen to me. And I expect loyalty from every one of you. You see any of this in our society? Well, verse 5. So what we find in number 4 is a general decree is made. And he sets up the statute, calls these people together and says, you know what I want you to do is that when you hear all these indicators, all these instruments of music, and all this is played, you just need to fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar set up. An element of worship, isn't it? You all must fall down. Government employees, general populace, civilians, everybody. You got to fall and worship the image. I recognize that decrees from the government can be very pointed, can be very discriminate, and of course we know that they pass all types of laws, and well, it can be general statements such as this, everybody falls down, or it can be targeted. It happens. Point number 5, the people then are expected to acknowledge, to honor, and to obey. I mean, really, when you stop to think about this is a pretty simple thing. Here's this big image there, and they're looking at that, and they go, wow, that's tremendous. And they find out that they're being commanded now that when they hear all this music, they need to bow down and worship the image. I mean, really, it's a simple thing. Music, bow. It's not that difficult. Well, it is difficult if you're going to consider it to be a matter of worship. This involves worship. I'm made to think that during the tribulation time that the devil and the mark of the beast, all that involves worship. And so don't be deceived by all of that. And so here's Nebuchadnezzar sets this up, and he wants people to worship his image, because what that is that's a worship of him. And they like that. People in position of power like to be worshiped. And so point number 6, there is a threat of consequence. I mean, this political movement isn't just a matter of, well, we expect you to do this and you need to be obedient unto us. You better do it, or there's some consequences attached to that. And so what were the consequences? Well, you'll be cast to the burning fiery flame. Well, that's pretty rough, isn't it? Do this or you'll be burned up. Well, in verse 7 we read that all the music set off and the people fell down, and overall, of course you know why I say overall, because it wasn't everybody without exception, but overall the people complied. The end of verse 7 says that all the people, the nations, and the languages, they fell down and worshiped the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king had set up. And so we find in these first 7 verses the politics that are going on and the event that is placed before us. Of course, we have to hasten through the passage. So notice verse 8 through verse 12 that deals with persecution. Wherefore at that time certain Chaldeans came near. Chaldeans were Babylonians. They came near and accused the Jews. They spake and said to the king Nebuchadnezzar, O king, live forever. Thou, O king, hast made a decree that every man shall hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whosoever falleth not down and worship, that he should be cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom thou hast set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, have not regarded thee. They serve not thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. And so we see a description, a beginning of persecution here. And it's a specific group that is targeted simply because of their beliefs. The Jews believed in the one true God of heaven, and they worshiped that God and God alone. And although they're carried into captivity in a foreign country, they're being told you have to fall down and worship this image. They know that that is idolatry. They know that it is wrong. And because of their beliefs, the Jews will say, no, we're not going to do that. And we have specifically within our text, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these people now, because they refuse to worship the golden image, have become targets of the government because they believe differently than the people that are in power. Now the grand thing is that by great courage, these three men did not bow. And the Jews demonstrate a commitment to God. By the way, dear Christian friend, as we continue in this life and live in this world, we may well have to prove a commitment to God. Not a very happy thought, but we still need to entertain it. We just can't bury our heads in the sand and act like nothing's going on here. And so the Jews are targeted, but they demonstrate a commitment to God. And what we recognize within the passage is that those who disagreed with the Jews became their accusers. In verse 8, it tells them that those Chaldeans, well, they are the one, all the Chaldeans fell down. They worshiped the golden image. They're on board with the movement of the government, but these Jews are not. And so what they're going to do is they're going to point that out. You know, they were very good at that, because when Daniel didn't do everything they wanted, they pointed out Daniel. You know, well, he makes his prayer to God every day. And, well, that was a problem. And he was cast in a den of lions because of it. And here's three guys that would not bow the knee. These are rulers within the kingdom. They were government employees. They would not bow. And of course, everybody that bowed said, we don't like that because you're getting away with something. And maybe some of those people were people that didn't want to bow either, but they were too afraid to make a stand. Regardless of the case, they point the finger and they say that you are the problem. You're the issue here. I want to remind you, and listen if you will to Matthew chapter 10 and in verse 21. It says that during these last days, it says, and the brother shall deliver up the brother to death, and the father the child, and the children shall rise up against their parents and cause them to put to death. Isn't that amazing? Children will point to the fathers, and they'll cause them to be carried away and be executed. Parents to children, and brothers against sisters, and so forth. The family members, can't even trust them. How sad that is. And so what we see within the text here, as we look into Daniel chapter 3, persecution arises, persecution emerges, simply because these guys said, we're not going to worship the way you tell us to worship, because we worship one true God. Well, the people in political power don't care for that too much. And so we continue into the story in verse 13 through verse 15. We notice the politics and the persecution. Notice the pressure. And this isn't surprising, is it? Verse 13 through verse 15. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage and fury, commanded to bring Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then they brought these men before the king. Nebuchadnezzar spake and said unto them, Is it true, O Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, do not ye serve my gods, nor worship the golden image which I have set up? Now if you be ready at what time you hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, and dulcimer, and all kinds of music, you fall down and worship the image which I have made. King James translators inserted well. That's a good thing if you do that. That's really the intent of Nebuchadnezzar. But he says, But if you worship not, you shall be cast the same hour into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. And who is that God that shall deliver you out of my hands? And what we learn from this is that, boy, great pressure is being brought to bear upon these three guys. Now, they're not foolish. These are very wise men. You've got to remember, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were carried away. They were trained. They were educated. They were chosen of Nebuchadnezzar. I mean, these guys have been experienced in the kingdom. They've served the king for years, and they're not likely to be shaken very easily. They've learned a lot as they've grown and matured those many years under his service. But now the king brings them before him and says, this is what you need to do. Puts the pressure on them. Start to tighten the screws a little bit. What I recognize is, and I'm not that old, I guess. My wife keeps telling me I say that, and I am. But the thing is, you know, my brief experience in this world, I have come to learn that politicians who are despised are angry and vengeful. I've seen that. Haven't you seen that? Haven't you witnessed that? Now here's that Nebuchadnezzar being spurned by these three guys, and he's really upset. And he's taking care of these guys. He's chosen them specifically. And they served him for years. And now he's putting the pressure on them. And if you think that things are bad now, you wait till they really start demanding things of us. And you say, well, I'm not going to do that, and I don't believe that's right. And then see what kind of pressure they start pushing on. Well, what we find in the text is that those in opposition are confronted. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego opposed the command. And they're confronted with it. And Nebuchadnezzar just really in as much as saying, how dare you defy me? Who do you think you are? I'm the mayor of this. I'm the governor of this. How dare you? I'm the president, etc. Am I off base? I don't believe I'm off base. I think I'm right on target here. And so when we look in verse 14, what he wants to do is he wants to clarify the attitude of the rebellion. He says, I'm going to give you an opportunity. I hear that you didn't bow. I'm going to give you another shot at this. And so they're giving a second chance while being taunted by the king. Really, that's what we find in the text. Let's continue. Verse 16 through verse 18 is the purpose. And we'll look at this one verse at a time. The purpose. Verse 16 is the persecuted respond with uncertainty. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer thee in this matter. I mean, what are they going to say? Well, we know what they say and what they express, but they're just saying, well, there's not a whole lot for us to respond to. We're just simply going to do what we believe is right, whether you like it or not. But there's an uncertainty. It says within the text, we're not careful to answer in this matter. We really don't have much that we can tell you at this point. So in verse 17, we find them, however, responding with confidence. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of thine hand, O king. Well, that's great confidence. King, we don't really know what's exactly going to happen here, but we know one thing. If God wants to deliver us, he'll deliver us. If he doesn't deliver us, he won't deliver us. But you know what? We believe that God can. So in verse 18, they respond with boldness. But if not, be it known unto thee, O king, that we will not serve thy gods, nor worship the golden image which thou hast set up. That takes a lot of courage to look King Nebuchadnezzar in the face and deny his command and say, we're not going to obey you. That's great courage. I've never had any kind of that courage ever in my life. What tremendous courage these guys have shown. And what we see in the text is that they choose to remain committed and faithful to their God despite that. I don't know what's going to happen, and I don't know what the future holds for us. But I don't know that I can hold up under pressure like that. I really don't know that for sure. The only thing I do know for sure is God is in heaven, and he's on his throne, and he's in my heart, and boy, he can give us what we need in the last second. I do know that. But from a human perspective, I'm a sissy. I'll give in to it. I've faced the king. Are you kidding? It'd be easy to cave, wouldn't it? It'd be easy to give up. And these guys wouldn't do it. And that's the purpose of the text. We find that they're confronted, they're persecuted, they're pressured, and they just said, well, we're not really sure what God's going to do here, but we're not afraid of you, and we'll take anything you give us because we're going to serve our God and God alone. And so, of course, we know that they have to experience the pain. That's verse 19 through verse 23. Then was Nebuchadnezzar full of fury, and the form of his visage was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Therefore he spake and commanded that they should heat this furnace 7 times more than it was wont to be heated. And he commanded the most mighty men that were in his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and to cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their coats, their hosen, their hats, and their other garments, and were cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Therefore, because the king's commandment was urgent, and the furnace exceeding hot, The flame of the fire slew those men that took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell down bound into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. Well, we see that they were penalized because they rebelled against the king. They dare stood up against the political leader. And they were penalized for it. Well, the punishment was as was advertised, by the way. I mean, there's nothing new about this. In verse 6, when we read the political situation, how it involved, it said, well, here's the warning. If you don't fall down and worship, you'll be cast into the midst of the burning fiery furnace. I mean, so they shouldn't have been too shocked at that they're leading them off into the furnace. The punishment just is what they said it would be. And then we read in verse 20 in that passage that the politician brings his judgment to bear. So he commanded, okay, you're not going to listen to me. You're going to be cast in the burning fiery furnace. So he commands the soldiers to come, great big strong burly fellows, and the best, the strongest, and the meanest of the army, and binds them to go cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Oh, by the way, those guys that cast them into the burning fiery furnace were killed by the flame because it was so hot, and yet we know about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego abiding the flame. Well, what an encouragement that is. But what we recognize in verse 21 is as these guys bound them and carried them off and dumped them into this burning fiery furnace, that the persecuted received their penalty. Knew what to expect. They got what they expected, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. No surprise there. I submit unto you that we should always remember that sometimes the faithful have to suffer. Sometimes the faithful have to suffer. These guys, they said, we don't know what God will do. God can deliver us, but we're not sure what He wants to do, so we're just not going to follow you. So they were cast into the burning fiery furnace. Well, we know about the story. Before I continue on, I just want to make a quick mention unto you. There was a book that was given to me way back in the early 70s. And it was a book entitled Tortured for His Faith. And it was a book by Harolan Popov. The guy was arrested in 1948 simply because he was a preacher and he was a Christian, and he was arrested by the communists of Bulgaria, and he was cast into prison, and he was tortured for 13 years. So I started rereading this book about 2 weeks ago. I don't know that I could do that. I really don't. But I know what God can do. But he was arrested and tortured simply because he was a... They were wanting him to confess all sorts of things, but there wasn't anything to confess. He just simply was a believer. Sometimes we have to suffer. You think I'm being foolish about this? I'll just reflect back to the time of the pandemic. And I'll tell you, from my perspective, I think we got a very real clear picture of what our government is and what our government can do in a time of what they believe is distress. They kind of tip their hand a little bit here. I don't know what they did in Missouri, but in our state, the governor shut down churches. We were a non-essential business. For 30 days, we were non-essential businesses. We weren't allowed to gather, etc. You know what the rules were. I'm sure you had similar rules here. After 30 days, our governor said, you know what, we deem Christians and churches to be essential businesses. And so then he made it possible. Man, we never did quit meeting, to be honest with you. But we could meet legally after he said we could. But there were plenty of churches that their pastors were put into jail because they met despite what the government said you can't do. You cannot meet together. And these guys went to jail because they dared have a church service. I'm not going to argue the pros and cons and COVID and the deaths and all that kind of thing. That's not the point. The point is that the government came in, and they mostly did it to Christians. Well, you could go to the bars and the casinos yet, but Christians, you know what? You can't meet together. Oh, I'm not supposed to say that. But it's still true, is it not? That's what they did. They targeted Christians. They targeted believers. And there was persecution. Well, enough of that. They tipped their hand. Before I continue on, one more thing comes to mind I wanted to say. If I'm understanding it correctly, you know that conservative Christians are on the list of domestic terrorists for the United States of America. They consider you a... Put that down. Remember that. Because when the things get going rough and tough, and maybe it's another pandemic, who knows? Maybe it's World War, who knows? I don't have any idea what the future holds. But I'll tell you, the government can come in at any time and say, well, you know what? You're a terrorist. Brother Reynolds, we're going to put you in jail because we can't trust you. You're causing rebellion. It can happen. But the good news is, and that's why it might seem like the application here is negative. It's not negative. This is a story of encouragement. I don't want to turn Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the victory into defeat. It's not that at all. But I do think we ought to be aware. And we ought to be on guard. And we better be praying. I mentioned this morning about who it is we're going to depend upon. Do we take our cares to the Lord and depend totally on Him? Or are we going to say, well, God, we got half, you got half? But I'll tell you, comes a persecution like this, we don't have anything to give. We don't have anything to offer in my book. We're going to have to completely depend upon God to carry us through. Well, verse 24 through verse 25 is the preservation. The preservation. That's the good news. So we want to turn the corner and come around to the positive aspect. Verse 24, then Nebuchadnezzar the king was astonished and rose up in haste and spake and said unto his counselors, did not we cast 3 men bound into the midst of the fire? They answered and said unto the king, true, O king. He answered and said, lo, I see 4 men loose walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt, and the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. And so we find in the passage that God miraculously delivers His own. By the way, He didn't deliver them from it, He preserved them through it. Harold Popov was not delivered from it, but he was delivered through it. God grant us grace. Whether we have to go through it or we're delivered from it, we need God. Remember, this was as thought was possible. Remember in verse 17 when they were standing before the king and he's putting all types of pressure on them? They said to him, if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and He will deliver us out of thine hand. God can do it. They believed that. They just didn't know whether He would or not. And He did. So there's a preservation. And, we notice that the king sees the 4th man in the fire and recognizes that. He claims that it's the Son of God. That's probably just from his perspective of a pagan. But the world recognizes the supernatural working. That's the good news here. These guys stood up against the world, and the world came up on the short end. And the king says, well, something's going on here. At least he recognizes that. Verse 26 through verse 30, which is the end of the chapter, notice the praise. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the mouth of the burning fiery furnace and spake and said, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, ye servants of the Most High God, come forth and come hither. Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came forth of the midst of the fire. And the princes and the governors, the captains, and the king's counselors, being gathered together, saw these men, upon whose bodies the fire had no power, nor was an hair of their heads singed, neither were their coats changed, nor the smell of fire had passed on them. That's tremendous, isn't it? And then Nebuchadnezzar spake and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent His angel and delivered His servants that trusted in Him, and have changed the king's word, and yielded their bodies that they might not serve nor worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree that every people, nation, and language which speak anything amiss against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be cut in pieces, and their houses shall be made a dunghill, because there is no other God that can deliver after this sort. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Great praise occurs because of their faithfulness and God's deliverance of them. Notice that the persecution received a glorious victory. What a tremendous victory it was. They went through the fire. They didn't even have the smell of smoke on them. No hair singe. I can't even do that. I can't even do that cooking out on my barbecue. I smell like the barbecue every time I get done. I get the hamburgers and hot dogs, but that time I smell like smoke. I lift up the lid and the flame goes, and I burn half the hair off my hand. These guys went through the burning fiery furnace without a hair singed and without any smoke. What victory God gave. And so in this case, they emerged unscathed. But I would remind you that Jesus had the scars and the nail prints. The beating of the apostles left marks. Paul said in Galatians 6:17, "For I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus." Not everybody escapes unscathed. We may not escape unscathed. And the interesting thing about this, in this case, probably very limited, but so I'm just negative, what can I say? In this case, the politicians have a change of mind. I have a sneaking suspicion that wouldn't work in our society too much, but it worked with Nebuchadnezzar. It can work with them. You never know what can go on, but he has a change of mind. All of a sudden he says, oh, well, in that case, then everybody needs to worship this God, because this God delivered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. All the guys turns around 100%. And that's because God gave a great victory. He even appears to convert. Verse 29, he says, we got to worship this God and God alone, or we're going to cut your house, your places down, and you're going to be made a dunghill. Nobody can do anything like this God has done. What a remarkable change. Now, this is more likely a lip service based in awe. I mean, he's just shocked at this. But Nebuchadnezzar never did demonstrate too much that he really became a Jew. So I doubt that happened. But we can certainly understand why he would express these things in the midst of what he has just seen with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so what we find is, as we finish out our chapter itself, is that in this case, the persecuted are in an exalted position. In fact, they brought them from throwing them into the burning fiery furnace to giving them better positions in the government. That's not likely to happen to us either. But you never do know. Does that make any sense? Let me ponder a few things and I'll be finished. Number one, political leaders are by divine providence. I remind you of it. Romans 13:1 said, "For there's no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God." Number two, we all have an obligation to political authority. Romans 13:1 again says, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers." You may not like what's going on in the government. You know what? There are appointed government. And oh, by the way, we've got an election coming up. Get out and vote. Vote your heart. Vote the will of God. But anyway, you may not like what's going on, but the fact is they're appointed over us and we need to be subject unto. Number three, sometimes political leaders are in opposition to God. Not everybody, I'm glad, but some of them, and some of these people I see, they're so corrupt, they're so evil. It breaks my heart that they're leading this nation and they are corrupt and bad. So there are those that are in opposition to God. So in Acts chapter 4, verse 18, we're reminded that they called them and commanded them not to speak at all nor teach in the name of Jesus. I don't see it's very far down the road before our government says, you Christians, you're going to have to rein this in. We're kind of sick of what you do. You guys are rebellious, and you kind of hurting us, and you keep talking bad about us, and you won't do what we want you to do. And you know what? You better stop or else. I can see that real easily happening. Really, truly, for many years I thought that just can't happen in this modern time. But I keep reading these stories about these people that are persecuted. Even today, there are thousands of Christians being persecuted all around the world. And in this modern, enlightened generation, Christians are being persecuted simply because they will not bend to their will. They will not give up Christianity. Political leaders are often in opposition to God. Number 4, sometimes civil disobedience is proper. Sometimes it is. Acts 4:19 says, whether it be right in the sight of God to hearken unto you more than unto God, judge ye. The leaders said, you quit preaching in this name of Christ. And they said, who are we going to follow? And so in Acts chapter 5, verse 29, similar setting, it said we ought to obey God rather than men. Boy, that's going to take courage. It's going to take a lot of grace. The government's not going to like what you do and like how you stand. And sometimes it's going to take a disobedience to the government because we're going to obey God rather than men. By God's grace, we'll be able to do so. Number 5, we must be willing to suffer for God's sake. We must be willing to suffer. Acts 5:41 says they departed from the presence of the council, rejoicing that they were counted worthy to suffer shame for His name. May God grant us grace. Number 6, God is able to deliver us, but He doesn't always do so. Remember verse 17. They said, if it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and He will deliver us out of thy hand, O King. He can. But that doesn't mean that He will. But I submit unto you either way, we are not to bow to tyrannical leadership. In my introduction, I gave you a part of the song by the Statler Brothers, The Fourth Man. Now that we have covered the story, I thought it proper to finish the song. Now the prophet Daniel tells about 3 men who walked with God. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, before the wicked king they stood. And the king demanded them bound and thrown in the fiery furnace that day. But the fire was so hot that the men were slain who forced them on their way. Now when the few were thrown in and the king rose up to witness this awful fate, he began to tremble at what he saw, and in astonished tones he spake, did we not cast 3 men bound into the midst of that fire? Well, though I see 4 men unhurt, unbound, and walking down there. There's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and fiery coals they trod. And the form of the 4th man that I see is like the Son of God. They wouldn't bend. They held on to the will of God, so we're told. They wouldn't bow. They wouldn't bow their knee to the idol made of gold. They wouldn't burn. They were protected by the 4th man in the fire. They wouldn't bend. They wouldn't bow. They wouldn't burn. God grant us grace not to bow.